Okay. Hello and welcome to this meeting of Materia. Thank you all for sort of figuratively being here with us. Today, I have the pleasure and the luxury really and the honor to introduce our speakers. And it is really, to me at least, a pleasure and an honor because Valeria and Fabián are not only the most brilliant thinkers I know, but also amongst the most, I think, inspiring and generous people that I've met in my years as a PhD student. So again, this is just truly a luxury to have you here presenting. So without further ado, what we're going to do is the following. We're going to hold the talks back to back, and then we're going to open the doubly metaphorical floor for questions. So feel free to use the chat for that purpose, or you can raise your hands and we will ask you to unmute yourselves. Okay, so Valeria Meiller is a PhD candidate in Spanish and Portuguese at Georgetown University. Her research is at the intersection of the environmental humanities and Latin American studies. Her dissertation, Argentina, a Nation of Flesh, proposes a regional history of modernity through the trope of the slaughterhouse. And the title of her talk for today is Matadero Modelo, Argentine Rural Modernity Seen Through the Slaughterhouse. And I'm going to present, should I present Fabián now as well? Okay, cool. I apologize for that. Okay, Fabián Darío Mosquera holds a master's degree in comparative studies in literature, art, and thought from Pompeu Fabra University, Barcelona. He also holds a master's degree in Hispanic Languages and Literatures from the University of Pittsburgh. He was an assistant professor of comparative literature at the University of the Arts in Ecuador, and he's now a PhD candidate in Hispanic Languages and Literatures at the University of Pittsburgh. And the title of his talk is Pasolini, Fireflies in the Synagogue of the Iconoclasts, Affective Materialism and Poetics of Community in Apocalyptic Times. So yeah, take it away.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank everybody at Materia for inviting me to talk today, and especially to Romina for organizing this event, and to my friends and collaborators, Vika Revic and Agustin Shang, who have been key for this research to come to life, and to all of you who have kindly joined this Zoom meeting. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts today about flesh and meat in my home country of Argentina. I'm going to try to share my screen now. Okay, here we go. Matadero Modelo, Argentine Rural Modernity Seen Through the Slaughterhouse, analyzes slaughtering facilities built by Francisco Salomone in the Argentine Pampas. I try to demonstrate that these structures epitomize a critical moment in the modernization process of my country's culture, which was and still is intimately related to cattle breeding and the meat industry. I argue that Salomone's slaughterhouses contributed to a specific formulation of Argentine modernity that questions the Euro-Western understanding of the modern slaughterhouse as a privileged space where to identify nature and culture's divide, which I here understand as conceptualized and criticized by thinkers such as Bruno Latour and Philippe Descola. The understanding of the slaughterhouse as an epitomized modern space can be found in the work of authors such as Noel Vialles and Timothy Pachiat, who have defined the slaughterhouse as a concealed space that aims to hide the operations that transform the living animal from a natural being into the commodity of meat. I quote, "De-animalizing the animal," end of quote, as Vialles calls this series of operations, and I quote, "keeping the task of slaughterhouse workers concealed from ordinary members of society," end of quote, as Pachiat states, are necessary to divide the conceptual identification of the cow as part of the living versus meat as a product. Based upon this understanding, Matadero Modelo proposes that Salomones slaughtering facilities are performative spaces where the visualization of animal killing is key to advance Argentine's efforts towards modernity. In this talk, I will explain how the design of the slaughtering facilities signals, instead of hiding, the work that is performed there. Salomones' design played a fundamental role in eliciting the power of the state and consolidating the beginning of rural modernity through the meat industry. The political climate of the 1930s was clearly reflected in Salomones' work. After the 1929 stock market crash in the United States, governments began to invest heavily in public work to reactivate their economies and generate jobs. New York City erected fabulous buildings that served as icons of the promise of modernity. The Empire State Building that you are seeing on this slide and the Chrysler Building on this slide were the two clearest symbols of that recovery project. As part of the same building boom, the Cabana Building on this slide now and the Obelisco National Monument were built in Buenos Aires in 1936. These buildings reflected a paradigm shift in the concept of urban space that, in the second half of the 1930s, and under the provincial government of Governor Manuel Fresco, was transplanted to the province of Buenos Aires through Salomones' work. Influenced by a modern urban imagination and the aesthetic of Art Deco, Salomone erected more than 70 pieces of civic infrastructure through the provinces of Buenos Aires between 1939 and 1940. A handful of typologies repeat through his work. Municipal palaces, which we see in this slide, cemeteries and slaughterhouses. Between 1937 and 1938, in the span of 2 years, Salomone built 19 municipal slaughterhouses through the province of Buenos Aires. I quote, "The Albert Speer of the Buenos Aires plains," end of quote, is how writer Juan José Becerra refers to Salomone. His allusions to Speer, who was the chief officer of construction for the Nazi Party from 1934 to 1937, aims to establish a parallel between the collaboration that Speer had with Adolf Hitler and the relationship that Salomone established with the governor of Buenos Aires, Manuel Fresco. Historians agree that Fresco was inspired by Benito Mussolini's political program in Italy, including the importance given to corporate pacts and the protagonic role of the state. Fresco assumed power through electoral fraud, and his mandate always maintained an authoritarian outlook. His years in power are still called the infamous decade. Salomone used monumentality to make humans seem small when confronted with the presence of the state. Each of his buildings encompass an important biopolitical function. The opulent municipal buildings located at the center of the urban grid stood as inescapable visualizations of the state's presence and the power of its laws. Similarly, the cemeteries, which we see in this slide, signal the importance of regulating death, both by the state and the Catholic Church, as it becomes clear through the proliferation of crosses at the front of the cemetery gates where Christs and exterminator angels preside over this so-called gardens of peace. Finally, the slaughterhouses, while intrinsically foreign both to the traditional field of architecture and to the state, stood as fundamental spaces to epitomize the modern rural imaginary that was a trademark of the infamous decade. The overarching biopolitical aim of the slaughterhouses was to manage animal death with a strong hygienist imprint. This intentionally resonated with the spirit of the European eugenic projects of the 1930s and 1940s. I quote, "Modernity arrived in the countryside," end of quote, concludes Juan Rufa in his chapter devoted to Salomone's slaughterhouses. As part of his modernization project, Governor Fresco wanted these facilities to be modern, sanitary slaughtering spaces with effluent treatment and veterinary controls. This way, these new industrial spaces would improve the ancient practices of animal slaughter, which did not differ much from the slaughtering methods described in the 1839 novella, The Slaughterhouse by Esteban Echeverría, that I look at in another chapter of my dissertation. Salomones' design modernized the slaughtering methods used at the time by providing functional spaces for the systematic and efficient slaughtering of animals. In an interview, Luis Tata Mocha, a former worker at the Wamini slaughterhouse with whom I collaborated to make the Case of Meat, the video that some of you have watched, recalls his experience in a way that highlights this efficiency. I quote him: "I would slaughter 10 animals a day. I'd come into the slaughterhouse at 1 and leave at 4:30 in the afternoon. It would only take me 10 minutes to slaughter each animal." End of quote. Nevertheless, this efficiency is only a part of the architect's aim. Both small and large facilities, with variations depending on their sizes, clearly exceeded mere functionality. For the sake of brevity, I will offer you only 2 examples for this argument. What you are seeing on screen right now is a 3D model of Salomones' Wamini slaughterhouse, built through photogrammetry during a field trip in 2019 in collaboration with architect Vika Rebeck. Though Salomones' work has received some attention during the last couple of decades, the slaughterhouses have remained the most neglected part of his work. This is mainly because after they were closed in the 1980s, unlike the municipal buildings and the cemeteries, they became obsolete modes of technology. The dilapidated state of these buildings led us to question how to contribute to their preservation, and our partial response was the construction of this web archive. One of the most distinctive features of Salomones' slaughterhouses are the towers, which were meant to hold the water tanks of the facilities. In this slide, you can see the water tower of Wamini slaughterhouse, which evokes the design of a futurist antenna. Salomone expressed space through opposition. The Pampas plateau and its incessant flatness and all its horizontality came into a dramatic, almost violent contrast with the scale and the style of his work. Another element of this particular building that stands out to spectators is its contour. When looking at it from above, one discovers that it resembles the head of a cow, perhaps depicted in a cubist style. This might not be a coincidence, since Salomone created very concrete design references through all of his work and was known to have drawn all of his blueprints himself. None of these buildings seem to say, paraphrasing what Noel Vialles and Timothy Pachurat imagined when theorizing about the space of the slaughterhouse, nothing is happening here in this invisible and neutral space. On the contrary, buildings unequivocally announce their function from their signs, with large concrete letters spelling slaughterhouse, municipal slaughterhouse, model slaughterhouse. I would also like to spend a few minutes discussing the slaughterhouse of Azul, perhaps because it is the town where I was born. I was raised in a cattle ranch that is only 15 minutes away from this building, which I passed all the time. It is a monumental space designed with a deliberate aesthetic intention rather than just serving as an industrial space. The main element that stands out is its vertical tower, shaped in a way that immediately evokes the figure of a blade, as a symbol of the work performed inside. The intricately detailed molding on the walls, whose only function is to embellish the building, is also remarkable in a slaughterhouse. The overall shape of the building is disconcerting. The semicircular shape of the floor plan gives the sensation of encountering a futuristic space that sometimes has been compared to a beautiful ship that is at the same time uncomfortable and brutal. I would like to conclude by showing this photograph from Luis Tata Mocha's family archive, in which you can see a large group of workers posing inside the slaughterhouse with large quarters of meat to evoke the years before 1980s, when the Argentine national government decided to centralize the meat industry through privately owned meat factories. The central government issued new sanitary regulations that these rural slaughterhouse facilities were unable to meet. Nonetheless, Salomones slaughterhouses are still part of a very particular aesthetic through which the nation imagined and continues to imagine itself. It is a history where the prominence of cattle and the importance of the meat industry contest the idea of concealment. These buildings highlight the importance of this industry for the development of a national identity deeply dependent on meat and cattle. Putting these buildings within the broader map of, I quote, the cultural slaughterhouses, end of quote, the term that Gabriel Giorgi coins in his book Formas Comunes to refer to the literary representations of the slaughterhouse in the work of contemporary writers such as Martin Cohen, and Carlos Busquets, furthers a constellation of slaughterhouse representations within Argentine culture. In conclusion, these unique designs, which incorporated verticality, large scale, and a mode of identifying themselves that defied the traditional Western idea of the slaughterhouse as a modern space of concealment. On the contrary, these buildings subverted the idea of a radical separation between the circulation of meat as a product and the existence of the animal as a living being. They serve as evidence of how Argentine modernity is inherently tangled up with the existence of cattle, the meat industry, and the space of the slaughterhouse. In their present state, as ruinous or obsolete extensions falling from the margins of the urban grid, or as repurposed pawns, these slaughterhouses serve as a different model, the tangible trace of an aesthetic political project through which the nation imagined and set into motion a particular moment of its process of modernity. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to your questions after Fabián's talk.
Okay. I have to thank Materia for the invitation, and especially Romina, who has been very, a very great colleague to me, and Valeria for sharing this space with me and the people here. So I'm gonna read, and I'm gonna share my screen. Is that possible? Okay, wait. Can you see it? Okay, so this is Pasolini, Fireflies in the Synagogue of the Iconoclasts, Affective Materialism and Poetics of Community in Apocalyptic Times. In 1941, young Pier Paolo Pasolini wrote, while being a student in Bologna, a letter to his friend Franco Farolfi, in which the poet narrated the discovery of an immense number of fireflies during an expedition with his companions. The flickers moved him to meditate on the splendor of friendship, and at dawn to strip off his clothes and dance in honor of the light. As Mariano Maresca and Juan Ignacio Mendiguchia have pertinently studied, the firefly will become a forceful category within the Pasolinian critical lexicon. Georges Didi Uberman has outlined the trajectory through which this came to be. Pasolini decided to subvert the semantic implications of the eighth Bolgia or Bolgia in Dante's Inferno, the Bolgia of those evil political counselors surrounded by fireflies, enclosed by the miserable glory of the damned, not the brilliance of well-earned celestial joys, but rather the small, painful glimmer of wrongs. It goes without saying that Pasolini writes his letter in a moment in which fascism comes across as unappealable. The abject politician is now on the spotlight. He controls both shadow and absolute luminosity. The intermittence of the firefly becomes then a precarious but obstinate form of resistance, a lacunary image of the future and not a great horizon of salvation, even in Benjaminian terms. Didi Huberman thus evoked the letter of 1941 to underscore that Pasolini's entire body of literary, cinematographic, and political work seems to be shot through with such moments of exception. But what interests me at this point is to evaluate how this complete inversion of the relationship between Luce and Luziole, Light and Firefly, entails what Chris Rabeto Viaglioli has coined as Pasolini's materialism. Pasolini reads the comedy less for its imagination of celestial entities than for its descriptions of earthly things and human passions. The diligent search for a genuine capacity of historical, thus political resistance, the anthropological work of survival. As we know, these are ethic historical potentialities that Pasolini finds in popular culture. Though sometimes romanticized, this cultural otherness implies an energetic register not yet subsumed by the industrial consumerist pattern that the poet labels post-war repressive tolerance, or by the teleological notion of progress informing both leftist partisan politics and bourgeois neo-capitalism. Vernacular religiosities, peasant and subproletarian dialects, mythical renderings, sexuality as somatic truth and political episteme, all these are vital dimensions of an alterity that resists or could resist moral reification. This sense of vitality and popular survival invite us to ruminate on the materialist traditions within which Pasolini is inscribed. Let us highlight that this author has not escaped, for example, the present-day materialist or post-anthropocentric turn. Some insightful scholars have recently referred, for example, to Pasolini's political animism, Federico Luisetti, or have proposed a Pasolini for the Anthropocene, Karen Pincus. We can talk about that later. On the other hand, it is indispensable to reassess Pasolini's heretic relationship to Marxist materialism, a polemic rendering that opposes the role of instincts and sexuality to what traditional Marxism ascribed to the secular struggle between consciousness and false consciousness. This ideological imprint, as we know, brought the poet bitter discrepancies with the Italian Communist Party, from which he was expelled in 1949 due to moral transgression. We could entertain in that regard that the Italian filmmaker oscillates between the Sadian scélératesse and the Dantesque sceleratezza, villainy, moral commotion, whether when criticizing the obscene political obliteration of the body or when celebrating flesh as a privileged locus for a de-alienating episteme. From the 60s on, all this entails a Christian declination. When Pasolini was planning his film Bestemia, Blasphemy, a movie that was never shot, he referred to a Christ that should be materially truthful, materialmente vero. Such a figure took contour and density in the Gospel according to St. Matthew. I contend that the film offers a poetics of community whose ideological core entails, in Althuserian terms, proliferous forms of affective interpellation. Pasolini's cinema de poesía encompasses the cinematic formalism that produces camera consciousness, a self-reflection on the conditions of possibility of cinema itself. But what Pasolini offers is a beyond the cinematographic ensemble of fireflies that throws light on the ethical prospects for a critical community vis-a-vis a state of cultural and socio-political affairs assumed as anthropological catastrophe. This constellation of names is not a mere extra cinematographic anecdote apropos the film, but an ethical vitality grounded on its formal resolution, on its raw visuality, its ethical attention to the face, its radical messiah emerging from the Basilicata black and white landscape. I call this community the synagogue of the iconoclast, borrowing the expression from Juan Rodolfo Wilcox's novel that narrates the imaginary life of 33 bizarre characters. We could connect this fascination for heterodox communities, for the community against the grain, with a suggestive moment of creative association in Wilcox's life, the moment in which he accepted to participate as an actor portraying Caiphas in the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Caiphas holds both a privileged stand in the Jerusalem synagogue and a wretched dwelling in the Dantesque circle dedicated to the hypocrites. Pasolini is beyond the cinematographic synagogue and places a different affective topography. Wilcock is part of it in as much as he exemplifies another Pasolinian well-defined feature, linguistic reterritorialization. A young Giorgio Agamben is another of the non-professional actors recruited by the filmmaker, in this case for the role of Apostle Philippe. Both intellectuals will share in the years to come an apocalyptic vision expressed by Pasolini when he publishes in 1975 a text titled The Power Vacuum in Italy, in which the motives of the Luziole is recasted to equate the disappearance of the fireflies to the unescapable destruction of popular episteme through what the poet hyperbolically calls cultural genocide. It is the same tone that we find in Agamben's Infancy and History, concerning an alleged widespread poverty of experience, both also in Benjaminian terms. But it's crucial to acknowledge that Pier Paolo Pasolini also stressed, if, along with apocalyptic vision and the anxiety that it provokes, there weren't also a bit of optimism in me, I would very simply not be here. Along those lines, Agamben, like Pasolini, is a great profaner of things that the general consensus deemed sacred. And like the filmmaker, the philosopher attempts to rethink the anthropological paradigm contained in the very long history of the word sacer or sacer. If the homo femina sacer is the ill-fated subject included in a given juridical or moral system just to emphasize exclusion as an opaque category, and if we assume here such a subject as a vector to galvanize any ethical topography in the face of cultural and political devastation, we should then high point Pasolini's election of novelist Natalia Ginsburg for the role of Mary of Bethany. That's Pasolini, that's Ginsburg, and that's Giorgio Bassani, another Jewish Italian writer who was an anti-fascist resistant. For the role of Mary of Bethany, the woman who interrupts the apostles' dinner and anoints Jesus' head. According to Joan Acocella, she has often been said to be a prostitute, for which some disciples object to her presence. In the Italian slang of Pasolini's Bolognian days, the term Luziola designates both the prostitute and the usherette armed with a little flashlight to guide the spectator among the rows of seats in the old movie theaters. The Bolognian letters show, of course, no bravado or youthful macho infatuation with prostitution and its intrinsic exploitation, but a sense of solidarity, both in the sense of a Christian inflection and the aforementioned reassessing of Dante's poetry, with those Luziole of flesh and blood assumed as part of the subproletariat popular episteme. The same with the usherette, the discovering of cinema as what Pasolini called language of things. Natalia Ginsburg, the impromptu actress, is the femina sacer, the ethical firefly par excellence. She experienced fascist violence as a Jewish, as a leftist resistance, as a woman. Her husband, writer Leon Ginsburg, was incarcerated, tortured, and assassinated by Mussolini's regime. The story goes that the last phrase of Leon to his family was, "Be brave." Natalia became an intellectual strongly committed to the public sphere while struggling to conceive in her writing the coordinates for a family lexicon, which is the title of his famous novel. Her gaze challenging Judas Iscariot in Pasolini's movie is a truly beautiful moment. I couldn't find a picture of that, but that's a great scene. A firefly-like figure is equally Alfonso Gatto, who plays Apostle Andrew. An adventurous, multifaceted man, Gatto was, like Pasolini, also a dissident communist. Incarcerated during the fascist regime, he later became one of the most important Hermetic Italian poets. When asked about how he felt lending Pasolini a hand for Make the Gospel, he responded, "I'm lending him my feet. This is a long path." After his death, Eugenio Montale dedicated Gatto an elegy expressing, "To Alfonso Gatto, for whom life and poetry were a unique testament of love." Here, poetry and love resonate with dissident vitality, politics with resilient affective episteme. Let's not forget that Pasolini cast his own mother, Susana, as Mary, and that in his poem Súplica a Mia Madre, he simultaneously asserts and implores, we survive. I pray to you, do not desire to die. Mother, mater, memory, survival. Pasolini's desideratum entails the ethical awareness not only of a passion susceptible of being communicated, as Wittgenstein would have demanded, but a passion experienced in heterodox community. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabián. There's a roaring clap in the virtual auditorium for Valeria and for Fabián. Thank you both very much. I guess Jimena, Lea, and I will moderate questions. I'm sure we also have some questions to ask. But I think a good starting point for a meeting like ours is to ask Valeria if you have any question for Fabián, and reciprocally, Fabián, if you have any questions for Valeria.
Can I start? Or
Please, thank you.
Yeah, I was watching the documentary that Valeria suggested to watch, and I was captured by the sentence or the phrase Jimi Hendrix sentence on the wall, right? Power of love, love of power, and then the reflection on flesh, meat, right? And that differentiation that we have in some languages and we don't, we have not in Spanish, like carne, right? I was thinking about this, like this community drive. I mean, drive towards community that I'm like identifying in this Pasolinian horizon. And how would, I mean, what's the cosmopolitical gesture today towards opening that community towards the animal, for example, right now? I mean, there's a lot of discussion about that, but from your perspective, what would that gesture be in terms of a political agency? And so I was thinking, like, rethinking the status of the concept of the category of community, incorporating these all different implications. So that was just to start.
Thank you, Fabián, for your question. Thank you for watching the documentary too. And I think that the way I think about it, particularly in the communities that I'm looking at and in these rural spaces, is that I don't know if this gesture towards broadening the idea of community is new. Maybe what has changed is the way that we think about the ethical implications of that gesture or of the status of the non-human animal within that community. But I think that if something has become clear to me through my research is that that broader space and those entanglements, even through violence, have been taking place for a very long time in the history of the Argentine slaughterhouse, right? And in the way that those spaces have become like not only like spaces of actual slaughtering of animals, but as like really prominent cultural spaces by which we tend to think of our own politics and identity as humans, right? So I think if anything, what we are seeing with the turn in the environmental humanities and animal studies and thinking through the Anthropocene is that we are trying to shift the way that we create those connections. But if we follow with what scholars like Descola and Latour have been saying, I mean, the idea of that separation is almost fictional. It has never taken place. We have been entangled. The question is, how do we want to think of those entanglements or perform those entanglements as we move forward in the midst of the current environmental crisis, right? I think I'm going to need a little bit more time to think about what to ask Fabián. So I'll open up the floor. And I thank you very much for your question. I think there's a lot in your talk that I want to organize and look at my notes for a little bit longer.
I think that sounds fantastic. And I have a feeling that your work read together speaks to the times, to emerging critical paradigms. One could see your work as symptomatic of broader shifts in the field, and that's something that I'm very interested by, and I might ask some questions in that regard. But we have two questions first. One from Sue Goldmark. Sue asks, Valeria, could you tell us more about how growing up on a cattle ranch influenced your PhD thesis? And I'll go ahead and also read Professor Gwen Kirkpatrick's question for Fabián. She says, I recently saw the film and was struck by its debts to Italian neorealism, contradicted, it seems to me, or complemented by the passions of the story. And that, Fabián, is also in the Q&A function. Valeria, also on the chat, you have Sue's question if you want to read it yourselves.
I think you can go ahead, Fabián, and answer first, right? I already talked about it.
Yeah, when Romina asked me about any particular content that I could suggest to watch in order to contextualize what I was going to talk about, I thought on about in the Gospel according to Saint Matthew, but also La Ricota, which is the displaying some kind of allegoric scene of the passion, right? Because regarding the neorealism, yeah, I mean, if we go to the theoretical work by Pasolini, and when he coins the concept of cinema di poesia, cinema of poetry, he's emphasizing some kind of avant-garde inscription. Like he talks about the technical scandal through the montage. He talks about camera consciousness, this like a self-reflective or meta cinematographic gesture. But when you go to the first movies that he made in the early 60s, Acatone, Mama Roma, and even the Gospel according to St. Matthew, they're very, very attached to neorealistic premises, right? Almost a sort of ethnographic display of the human face in the close-up that has political and ethical implications as well. So yeah, that connection is there, and but at the same time, it was very strange to me that little scholarship had been produced regarding this kind of gesture that he has of producing the film with a little help of my friends, right? They're not only non-professional actors, peasants or people that of the outskirts of Rome that he is, calling into the neorealistic imprint, but he's also trying to dialogue with some kind of cultural horizon that is taking place in Italy. For example, I just shared some examples, but the actor who plays John the Baptist is also a poet. It was Mario Socrates. No? He was an expert on the poets of the Spanish Civil War, right? So what I'm trying to say is that, yeah, the neorealistic trend is there, but there's also something else happening that is not only beyond cinematographic, but that contains or refracts the ethical implications of a cultural scene that was in the 40s, resistant fascism, articulating creative lives, even in the face of radical political devastation. Consumerist what Pasolini called televised neo-capitalism. So yes, it's a very yeah, it's a very like I wouldn't say neo-realistic, but the celebration of that possibility, of that attachment to organic life, organic social life is there evidently. And I'm finishing with this. The context of the movie is the acceptance of the invitation by the Pope, Juan XXIII, to dialogue with non-Catholic artists. So the heterodox Marxism is there. In an interview, Pasolini said, the discourse of Christ has become the discourse of Marx, and it was very polemic, of course. So yes.
Well, thank you. Valeria, did you want to respond?
Yes, I'll do it very briefly, but I think that, of course, you know, I grew up in that environment, but if there's anything that I can pinpoint from that experience of growing up in rural Argentina that kind of called me to look at the slaughterhouse was that after the 2001 crisis in Argentina, as the television was broadcasting people breaking into supermarkets, riots in the streets, what was actually happening in the countryside was that very underprivileged people were breaking into our property and other properties to slaughter animals and take whatever they could with them. So the shape that moment in Argentine history took in the countryside had to do immediately with animal slaughter. And I think that it was that that happened in December, which is the end of classes. And I think that I went back to school in March and read The Slaughterhouse by Echeverria. So I got very early on in life, I got this idea that The Slaughterhouse was a good way to start, you know, thinking about what was going on in the politics of the country.
Fascinating. We have questions from Romina, Daniel Hernandez, and Sebastián Urli. Romina?
I don't have any question. I have many questions, but I'm not going to I'm not going to pose them now. But we do have a question for Fabián in the chat, and then Daniel has a question, and we're going to allow him to talk. And he has a question for Valeria. So let's read the question for Fabián. Let's allow Daniel to ask the question for Valeria, and then we'll allow you to reply in whatever your order you deem convenient.
It sounds great. Sebastián Urli asks, I know Fabián has been working on different expressions of Marxism in Latin America, so I would like to know how Pasolini's notions of community and resistance relate or differ to a certain extent to specific situations in Latin America.
I think that's an important question because Pasolini, in a certain moment, he became like very aware of, or he coined his own sort of category of the third world, right? And we have, for example, a note for an African Oresteia, and we have a note for a film on India. But he doesn't dedicate any entire film to Latin America. There is a fragment in La Rabia about the Cuban Revolution. And despite that fact, the relationship between Pasolini and Latin America has turned into a very strong, settled field of study. Maybe I can show you, I was thinking about that because I had it here, like, the first experience was a congress that Professor Daniel Link in Buenos Aires organized in Untref 10 years ago. And then there is this book, I don't know if you can say Los Condenados de la Tierra, Pasolini in America Latina, Héctor Cohen and Sebastián Russo. And they were posing the question of why Pasolini's thought is pertinent for Latin America. And what he's doing is to re-semanticize some Gramscian categories like subaltern, right? But he's also pivoting in a very critical way the sclerotic fetishization that the Communist Party made out of Gramsci. thinking, for example, that the subject of emancipation will be the mere outcome of historical reason and not this like experience that also has to do with body, somatic truth, instincts, or organic attachment to the world, you know, and so that's why I think that Pasolini is pertinent today. Dissidents in the many ways in which he inscribed himself in dissident agendas, you know, because, and I'll finish with this. So if he is like interpolating the possibility of body and affects and sexuality in the way he is doing it, the vitality, you know, the trilogy of life, maybe he's inscribing himself in what, you know, currently they call like new forms of libidinal economy towards a leftist thought, and etc. But he's very critical with the Freud-Marx paradigm as well. You know, he has a poem that is called Proyecto for a Future Work, something like that, in which he says that he has to be very critical and ironic towards or against epistemological paradigms that are remastering forms of hierarchy, heterosexual, homosexual, primitive nations, developed nations, father, son. So all this like revisiting Gramsci from a different standpoint or place of initiation has created this interest in Latin America that is very, very interesting. To me, I think that we could inaugurate new transatlantic studies or new subaltern studies, you know, like interpolating the intra-European subalternities that could say something to our realities. And, you know, after the Bandung conference, Pasolini said, Bandung is the capital of 3 parts of the world and Italy, parts of it. So, yeah, so there is a link that is very interesting there.
Fascinating. So why don't we listen to Daniel's question and then we move with the other ones that are coming up that are really great.
Yeah, I mean, I know that Danny has a question and then Juan Esteban has another question for Vale. So maybe we can pair those, and Vale, you can reply to wherever you feel like it, and then you can follow up on whatever you feel like it as well with both Juan Esteban and Daniel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Fabián, and thank you, Valeria. Those were great talks. I wanted to voice this because more than a question, it's kind of a constellation of ideas, and I wanted to know, like, how would you react to this? It's also a question, of course. But so your presentation made me think about plenty things, lots of them related to the trope of what is the interior in Argentinian literature and what is the exteriority. And I've been reading recently Mariana Enriquez's novel, Tu parte de noche, Nuestra parte de noche, and also I thought about Historias Extraordinarias, of course, and this idea of el interior as this place where things are kind of hidden, where there's kind of this violence and this very bloody elements, and how this appears in the buildings you're studying, but beyond the allegorical trope of exteriority and interiority. I was wondering, how do you see these, how you connect this to this trope of what's the interior and what's the exterior in these buildings and in Argentinian culture in general?
Okay, and we can thank you, Danny, and we can also read Juan's question. Hector, do you want to read it?
Sure. So Valeria, building on the comparison between the matadero and the extermination camps, how do you see the relationship between spaces of animal slaughter and politics of memory and forgetting? How do you envision the cultural life of these architectural ruins? And he congratulates you on a great talk.
I want to thank both Juan Esteban and Daniel for their questions. I will address Danny's question first. I will express to him that I have this personal theory on how Argentine critical literary studies have been thought as a field. And I think that this interior-exterior dichotomy that he's proposing is there from the very beginning of the nation, since like, and I think that lots of the ideas that we're thinking through now today in the environmental humanities, like nature and culture, the animal and the human, all these binarisms that we're trying to work through are in Argentine literary studies and in Argentine literature from the beginning of the nation in spatial terms. So when we look at like Civilization and Barbarism by Sarmiento, what we have there is the idea of the countryside and the idea of the city, and the idea of the city as always looking into Europe, right? The Buenos Aires is like aspirational capital that is like looking to Europe through the ocean. And I think that we find that in many of the ways that literary critics have thought of space and of literature, right? When we talk about the figure of the orishero, which I wouldn't know how to translate. When we think about like the countryside, when we think about the impact that the countryside and the city had, the impact that had within literary studies in Argentina, the way that Sarlo conceptualizes these spaces. I think that we have been thinking about the interior and the exterior, we keep on thinking about these places in the terms that Sarmiento had thought about them. And I think that for me, what is interesting is to maybe move from these spaces as like symbolic or metaphorical spaces for civilization and barbarism, and to start looking at what's actually happening there, right? Or at least that's what I'm trying to do, right? Not to think about this like metaphorical liminal space, but to actually try to think of these spaces as spaces of encounter. And then coming to what Juan Esteban was asking, I think that one of the things I'm grappling with right now is the idea of thanatopolitics, and like drawing from Foucault and Espósito and the way that they're thinking through the Shoah and the extermination camp as the epitomized space of thanatopolitics. I'm trying to think, how do we think about this term and this idea beyond the human, right? Because I think that the way that biopolitics has been thought of so far has mainly to do with the human. And with and I think that I don't know if I have an answer for Juan Esteban yet, but this is what I'm trying to think through in my work at the moment. I'm trying to think through how do we expand or like push this ideas or these categories to think outside of the human realm.
We have a question, thank you very much, Valeria, from Aura Maria Sotomayor. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Didi Uberman's book is a critique of Agamben and Pasolini's disillusionment with the times. So how would you like to address the relationship between the community formed in the interior of the film and a future community? And maybe, why don't we bundle a couple of questions now, if anyone has them. I don't know if Jimena, Romina, or Lea have any questions at this point, or anyone else, if you'd like to quickly type, because it would be good to have those questions together and see if our speakers can answer some of them. I'm going to slide in a question also for Fabián that follows on Aura Maria's, I think, nicely. So what happens, Fabián, with Christian theology? I mean, I understand and appreciate the gesture of not going there, not going to, this is what the gospel says, this is Matthew versus Luke, and this is the notion of community. But is there something that we perhaps lose by looking at communities of the flesh without thinking of religion with its idealist baggage? And this is, coming from a materialist, but I'm being also a bit of a contrarian, if you would. Why not engage not just with femina sacer aspect, but also with the messianism, in like the Christian tradition that this is ultimately responding to. And maybe just to leave these questions posed, it might be that we don't have time to answer them, but let me also segue very quickly. Jorge Drexler has that song Noctiluca on a different register that you might want to think about, and Sebastian Wiedemann artist writer has something very interesting about the entrelugar cinematográfico, also the flickering. In case you want to expand on that constellation, Valeria, when you talk about epitomizing modernity or symbolizing these ideas, I wonder if there is some like backdoor return of meta-narratives, you know, that thing that we've been criticizing for the longest time, right? Is this like a backdoor return of the meta-narrative, the grand narrative of modernity? Also, I wonder, what is literature after hearing you? You know, what is the object of study? A big question, right? Maybe not to answer in a couple of moments now. And finally, when you talk about concealment, okay, it's not a modern space of concealment. What then, if any, would be the role of suspicion in methodology? We can talk about those at length at some other time, but I just wanted to make sure that I shared those questions with you. Anyone else would like to bundle a question in the Q&A? Yes, Isabel, let me read this one out loud. Thank you. From Isabel Mena. What is the nature of the relationship between the community surrounding Christ and the community of intellectuals and poets that surround Pasolini and appear in the movie? Is it metaphorical? Anyone else as we approach 1 p.m. in California?
Maybe I can just quickly, a few thoughts. For Valeria, I want to go back to the question that Danielle brought about interior and exterior, to maybe know if it could be thought of not only in spatial terms, but within the human-animal binary. And I was thinking of that because of something I read, and I'm going to send it to you. It's a reflection by Marisol de la Cadena on a slaughterhouse and the people that worked at it in Bogota. And it's really interesting because it has a story that is kind of parallel to the one you tell in the film we watched, in that it is very much something that looks at how El Matadero is a community of sorts, or an entanglement of sorts, in that the human and the animals kind of change each other in the way in which they live or die together. So there is an interiority and exteriority maybe to consider there. And for Fabián, it's just that I have been reading recently Severo Sardui's Cocuyo, and you have there firefly, right? Cocuyo, but also an hada, and there's a moment in which, I mean, it's really interesting because el hada is going to end up being what would be La Luchela, in that it's been, you know, she's been taken care of in that sense, so that she can be brought up to be a whore, right, or be sold at a market. And Cocuyo is the only one that is able to watch this from inside and outside, from like this liminal space that he inhabits, because he's an orphan too. So I wonder if there could be like some kind of Italian-Cuban, you know, back and forth between those those elements of celestial and more like earthly beings of light. And I don't know if there's any more questions or thoughts that are coming up. Otherwise,
it might be time for answers or reactions, and thereafter we're going to have announcements and probably adjourn. So Fabián, Valeria, take it away.
You can't throw a coin because you are in different places. So
Okay, I'm gonna start if it's okay. There is a lot of things. So I'm gonna try to synthesize. The first part of your question, Hector, I didn't hear that part because my internet started working wrong. So, but I'm going to the question by Aurea Maria. Yes, the Huberman is criticizing this apocalyptic vision, both by Pasolini and by Agamben. But he's criticizing specifically the text that Pasolini published in 1975 that is called the Void of Power in Italy, in which he equates the disappearance, the objective, specific disappearance of fireflies, the real fireflies in the outskirts of Rome, to the disappearance of what he understands as popular episteme, right? So there is a people that is lost. The people that he was infatuated with in the early 60s, when he was like researching for Acatone, is lost. It is a very pessimistic Pasolini, very pessimistic. There is the same moment of his abjuration of the trilogy of life, etc. And then what happens with Agamben is the poverty of experience in the infancy and history, but then he has a book that is called Means Without End, in which he conflates or juxtaposes the public sphere, the Schmithian public sphere, this people acclaiming the leader and this reactionary space with the contemporary society of spectacle. So people and image are no longer categories in dispute. They're close, they're obliterated. And if they're obliterated, but there's nothing to do. So what the Huberman states is that we have to keep looking for the intermittence of the Luzioli, the becoming minor of any potential political articulation, even in the sense of the Messiah, but it's a Messiah that enters through the narrow door, the Benjaminian Messiah. But on the other hand, the Messiah that we see in the movie, that we watch in the movie, is a very belligerent political Christ, which is the one that we see in Matthew, right? Relating all that I said with the question by Isabel, no? What is happening with the community that is surrounding this Christ, and what is happening with the community that is surrounding Pasolini? And what happens with the figure of Christ is very interesting. It's very interesting, for example, in the case of Ginsburg. Ginsburg, she was a secular Jewish woman who became Christian. She became Christian after being persecuted by fascism because she thought Jesus as the first Jewish persecuted in modern terms. So Christ is the same with Gatto, no? Gatto and the relationship that he had with the Communist Party, but also with the Catholic matrix, is what Pasolini called heretic empirism. But they were heretic both in relation to the Communist Party, which was some kind of a dogmatic Orthodox religion as well, and heretic in concerning the Catholic Italian matrix. When Pasolini shot La Ricotta, he was prosecuted for being disrespectful towards or against the religion of the state. So this idea of how to dialogue, to establish a dialogue from this contingent community with Christ is something that is vividly operating there. So yes, I think it's a very important question. And the Cocuyo, I think that it will contribute to my project of this transatlantic dialogue between Pasolini and a dialogue between Pasolini and Sarduy would be a very, very interesting and beautiful thing to do. So thank you for that reference. I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabián. Maybe Valeria, you want to answer some of the questions that came your way?
I think I will, what Hector is saying about the role of suspicion and methodology is gonna stay with me to think through some of these ideas. I think that when I use this idea of the slaughterhouses as this epitomized space of modernity, which does tap into the idea of, you know, it works as this this microcosm of this meta narrative on modernity as well. I think this is what I've found, and in thinkers like from the United States and from France and Europe in general, that when the idea of the modern state, like the modern slaughterhouse, like comes into play, it starts serving this function of hiding what does not want to be seen. And what I found really interesting about these buildings is that they are by all means saying we are here, right? So in a way, that is what I wanted to point out, this contrast between the way that slaughterhouses have been conceptualized in the West and the way that it works in Argentina, which is, I think, very particular to that space. And in terms of architecture, very particular to this government and this moment of history and this project of modernity that was so tangled up with fascism, right? Just that.
Thanks, everyone. We clearly have a lot to say and to share. This has been a vibrant intellectual exchange that we hope will continue in other media and occasions and in person soon enough. Let me pass the floor over to Romina for some announcements, and I'll do a final round of announcements and we'll wrap up. But we can also stay after we hit stop recording button and say hi if anyone wants to have a virtual coffee. We can do that too. Romy.
Yeah, actually, I have a question that may turn into an announcement. I know that you both have a very interdisciplinary approach to your object of study, which is not an object of study, it's not a single one, and you do not approach that object from the outside, but you're also practitioners. I know, Fabián, that you're involved in many writing projects and in like translation, editing, and Valeria, I know that you write poetry and that you also like visual arts and classic arts. So I was wondering whether you had any announcements to make for our attendees to be aware of.
Thank you so much. I think I will have no new announcements until I'm done with my dissertation.
The same here. I have nothing.
It's not fair because your committee members are in the audience, but anyways.
Well, I'm just going to say, just stay tuned and maybe do your stocking work properly and decently, and you're going to find amazing surprises.
All right, let me share the calendar of events coming up on March 11th. At the other side of the very short month of February, we're going to have Professors Ant Niebisch from Vienna University and Gisela Hefes from Rice. The format is going to be similar, short talks, conversation among speakers, and we hope that all of you who joined in today might also be interested in tuning in about 5 weeks' time when we will reconvene. In the meantime, we'll circulate readings, and we have amazing events also for the spring. We were hoping that some would be in person. We don't know yet. And our distinguished lecturer, there are good signs, but I won't mention him right away. Okay, so thanks everyone. It has been a pleasure. And bye for the recording. I'm gonna hang out for a little while.